Welcome to another episode of Outside Ourselves, a show with conversations that remind us faith isn't something we do, it's something we receive. I'm Kelsi. Outside Ourselves is a 1517 podcast. To learn more about all of our podcasts and all of our shows, please go to 1517.org/podcasts. I just finished up a conversation with the newest 1517 scholar in residence, Bruce Hillman. If you are unfamiliar with Bruce's work and the way in which he speaks, you are really in for a treat. Today, Bruce is going to walk us through a brief but very rich understanding and background on what exactly postmodern philosophy is and how it's tied to this idea of deconstruction. You might know that deconstruction is quite the buzzword, specifically in Christianity right now. Bruce kind of walks us back from that to explore how the term was originally used by postmodern philosopher Jacques Derrida. And in doing so, he actually shows us that deconstruction is something we shouldn't be afraid of as Christians, that it's something that can, when used correctly, work in tandem, work hand in hand with theology and with faith, as long as we have those Christian essentials kind of at hand. Hopefully you will come away with a better understanding of the idea of deconstruction, how it shouldn't be a boogeyman, we shouldn't be afraid of it, and how if we approach our sin, the sin around us, in humility, we are able to bring that to the cross, which we know and we proclaim and confess as Christians is the only place where we receive the forgiveness of sins and Christ's righteousness. All right, hope you enjoy the show. Hey, Bruce, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's exciting to be here.
Yeah, so excited. Bruce, you are recently a 1517 scholar in residence. That's new as of this year. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and then what you're doing now that you've joined 1517, what you're focused on?
Yeah, so I have been a pastor at a church in New Jersey for the last 16 years and then pastored a very small church in Minnesota 2 years prior to that. I'm originally from New England, from Connecticut. That's where I grew up and did most of my schooling there. And then after being in the ministry for a while, I just decided I wanted to change of pace. I'd always been sort of academically minded in my preaching and in my graduate work and stuff. So just decided it was time for a change and got a call from 1517 to come on board as one of their scholars in residence. I'm still somewhat embarrassed by that term, but part of that role means me helping out with the Thinking Fellows podcast, which is one of our other podcasts here at 1517, in addition to doing some research, writing, some editing for academic resources when needed, and just a bunch of different roles, but essentially academically minded things for the organization.
That's awesome. Yeah. You are one of my favorite authors to edit for
Oh,
the
no.
website. Seriously, because I think you bring such a unique perspective, and that, I think speaks obviously to who you are, but also kind of your background academically, because a lot of what you've studied is different than probably the normal contributor for 1517. Can you tell us a little bit about that academic background and kind of how you ended up where you ended up? Like why were you interested in the topics that you studied?
Yeah, so I got my bachelor's. I double majored in history and political science, and I was thinking at the time when I was in college that I was going to go to law school and that I wanted to do something in government. I wasn't quite sure what that was going to be, whether that would be in sort of the diplomatic services or maybe something more local at a political level, but that was just what I was interested in. And then right before I was graduating college, I started to feel a call to seminary, and I had always had an interest in theology. I'd actually grown up Roman Catholic before I was Lutheran, and I just felt like I was at this crossroads. I actually remember this rarely happens to me where I have like this direct clarity of thought, but I was working for a guy who ran an antique business, and he was away on vacation. I was watching his golden retriever named McCoy, and I was walking his dog down this street, and just worrying about my future. Like, I got to make a decision. Like, am I gonna apply for law schools, or am I gonna go to seminary? And it just occurred to me that, okay, when I reach the end of my life and I look back on my life, do I want to say, this was actually what went through my mind, which is a weird thing, but I said, like, did I want to say that I was able to pass a bunch of legislation that made the importation of cabbage into the United States safer for agriculture? Or did I want to say that I had done something more directly for the kingdom? Of course, those things aren't mutually exclusive. You can be a politician and have a godly vocation. But for me, that was how God gave me clarity. And I said, no, I have to do that. So I went to seminary, completed my 3 years of seminary, and then I went on for an academic degree in patristics, which is the study of the church fathers, where I did my work in early church and Augustinian studies, the studies of St. Augustine of Hippo from North Africa, a famous theologian. And it was there I also began to learn about postmodernism at a more formal theological level. The school I went to, so for my seminary education, it was a very conservative school. For my post-seminary education, it was a very liberal school. And so I had received sort of both what you might call a progressive Christianity at the academic school and a more traditional Orthodox Christianity at my seminary education. And I had sought that out. That's what I had wanted, because I had thought I would go on for a PhD and teach at a public university in the religion department. And I thought, well, I need to have a broad education in religion, to theological religion, to get that. But then when I was in seminary, I was also part-time taking a call as an associate pastor at a church, which is also something that if you teach a seminary is often required to have some years working in a church environment. So I thought, okay, kill two birds with one stone. But my mentor was a great friend of mine who hired me, actually passed away from cancer just a few months into my work. So that's how I ended up staying in the pastorate for so long, as I took over for that church, what was supposed to be a 2-year call, and ended up becoming a 16-year call.
Oh, wow.
So that's the short version of how I got to where I am now.
Okay. And did you, at the time you took over for the church, did you just feel like you needed to be there because he had passed away, or was it more like, no, this is like the direction I need to go in? I don't know. I'm just curious, because it seems like you had such a clear directive, and then it kind of changed, which I guess happens in life. But
that's a really good question. It's very insightful, because it was clear, but not in the way you would think would be clear. So what I mean by that is, I felt like my talents were in the academy, and I knew if I was going to be a pastor, I was always going to be a more academically minded pastor, that would be where my strengths were. And the church recognized that right away in me. So they knew that. And so I often had associate pastors who served with me who were much stronger on like pastoral care and that kind of stuff than I might be. But when the time came down to it, I just remember thinking, the church needs a pastor, and it's not good for the church to, this sounds pious in hindsight, but this really was my thought. It's not good for the church to have another transition, because they had a split some years before my mentor had arrived, and my mentor had arrived to heal that split. Then he got cancer and died. And I thought, like, for the church to have another transition right away would not be healthy for the church. And then I felt like, well, how selfish I would be if God had been calling me to enter into the ministry, and now I'm just going to get up and leave. Like, I felt a strong sense of belonging and calling to that congregation, and a love for that congregation, the people there, very much. It was a little hard in that I always felt a little bit of an insecurity in being a pastor, probably until the last 2 or 3 years, actually, because I always felt I was more of an academic than I was a pastor. But God provides. I think the church overall would say that I was, not a bad pastor, that I was caring for them, and I deeply cared for them. It was time to go. It was hard to go when I did. I didn't leave on bad terms at all. They didn't drive me out or anything like that. It was just, it needed a change of season. But it was, it's funny how God works things out that way. And
Yeah.
you can't always
Well,
plan it, but it's not bad if God changes your plan. It might feel that way at first, like a loss. You feel the loss sometimes of the change of plan, especially if you're type A like me, where everything has to
yeah.
be planned. But he knows what he's doing.
Yeah. And I think ironically too, you're saying you feel like you are not necessarily the most pastoral, but that decision to stay is a very pastoral decision. Like you're caring for you're considering the needs of the people that you're shepherding in a very real way. So I think that that's pretty amazing too, that God used you in that way to stay in a place you weren't necessarily expecting to stay. So
Yeah, and I think something that I didn't expect, which I've seen in hindsight, and that I hope continues to be true, is that being a pastor for so long hopefully changes the way I do and think about theology, how I think
yeah.
theologically. So I've
Yeah.
started to notice a difference in myself to the extent that one can examine oneself between the younger me who thought very academically because I was trained in the academy to the now older me who still thinks that way in one sense, but in another sense is also thinking theologically through the lens of a congregation and
Yeah.
people with real issues and problems, and trying to make sure that the theology is always landing there, Christ for them there, and moving in that way. Now, in any way, think I've perfected that. But what my point is that God will sometimes take you on roads you didn't expect, but he's also forming you in a different way. So hopefully the academic that I will become now is very different than the academic I would have been,
Mm.
because God has given me the gift of the pastorate, and I hope that that now will inform my theological thinking,
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
absolutely. Absolutely. I think that makes total sense. And it kind of dovetails with what I think we're talking about today. As you kind of mentioned briefly, you have a background in studying postmodernism and, what is all entailed within that. And I should probably say at some point, like, this is going to be very much an overview conversation. But part of postmodernism, and people may or may not know this, is this idea of deconstruction. And that's definitely become very much a buzzword, specifically for Christians in the last few years. You hear it all the time about Christians deconstructing and what that looks like. There's people either think it's terrible or they think it's good. We're going to get into all of that. But I think you as an academic and then as a pastor have such a unique, probably have such a unique view of this because you've studied it, but you've also, I'm sure, experienced it a little bit. As we get started, could you kind of give us an overview of what deconstruction historically looks like? Where does the word come from? Who used it first? How is it tied to postmodernism? And then maybe we can go from there to this idea of Christian deconstruction.
Yeah, so arguably the most important philosopher in postmodernism is a French Algerian guy named Jacques Derrida.
Mm-hmm.
And Derrida is the one who coins the philosophical term deconstruction. Of course, the word deconstruction existed prior to him, but it became a philosophical term when
Yeah.
he wrote about it. And his groundbreaking work is called On Grammatology, which I do not recommend anyone goes out and reads. It's known and famous even in philosophical circles as being just an incredibly difficult book to sludge through and understand, because Derrida purposefully writes in a confusing manner to help make his overall point about language. So you have an academic who's writing in a way purposefully confusing in order to make a point. And so it's not a book I recommend. But deconstruction is a method that exists within a greater philosophy of postmodernism. And very briefly, there's a lot to all of this, but postmodernism is a philosophy that says there is no grand stories, what they call meta-narratives. That's the fancy word that's used in the literature. There are no big stories that can there's no one big story that can give essential meaning to life. The creation story in the Bible, or it could be the story that science gives us of the Big Bang Theory, or it could be Buddhism, or it could be atheism. These stories, we use these stories to find ethics, to say what's good and bad, what's right and wrong. Cultures are influenced by these stories. And for most of human history, there was a story that guided a culture. Postmodernism espouses that we've come to the point in history where we recognize now that no one of those stories contains all the necessary truths for human flourishing, which is obviously in some sense an anti-Christian thing to say, because it's not a thing you're saying out of faith. It's a thing you're saying out of philosophy. But anyone who sympathizes with the assurance and haughtiness that can come in any institution of always knowing what's right and the harm that they've caused can have sympathy with postmodernism. Deconstruction is a method of reading within the postmodern philosophy that helps to make the point or present evidence in the court of public opinion on why postmodernism is true. And it's probably easiest to access deconstruction by first saying what it's not.
Okay.
There's a phrase that Derrida used that's really important, and he says, deconstruction is not destruction. So if you think about the word deconstruction as we use it now, it does mean something sort of like destruction. So we even can go to restaurants now and get, a deconstructed cheesecake or some weird thing like that. And it's all, the crumbs are on one side of the plate, and then there's like cheese here and cherries over here, and it's deconstructed. That's not what deconstructionism is in postmodernism and in the way Derrida envisions it. So one of the criticisms that you always get with postmodernism is that it destroys things. That may be an after effect of some ways of doing postmodernism, but it's not the goal of what deconstruction is trying to do. It's not trying to destroy things. In fact, it's trying to make things less certain, not to destroy them, and it's to make things more vague, to put it in a positive sense. It's to make things less certain in a negative sense. The other thing that deconstruction is deconstruction is not something that means taking a reading of something like a book and then pulling it all apart and saying, this is why it's dumb, or this is why the author. That's also not deconstruction in the postmodern sense. There are people who think that by doing that, they're being postmodern, but strictly speaking, they're not.
Yeah.
So what is it? It is a way of undermining binaries. And I am sorry to have to use some of this fancy language, but it's the only way to access the idea. So what's a binary? Yeah. A binary is simply a pair of opposites. Black, white, rich, poor, strong, weak, man, woman, and so on. In postmodernism, there is a view that humans naturally form and arbitrarily form, this is the postmodern idea, they arbitrarily form binaries. Ways of creating a pair of opposites. But here's where postmodernism makes an interesting observation, because that in and of itself that's kind of okay, but where they become particularly insightful is that within the binary, whichever one you discover, one of the pairs is privileged, is valued more than the other one. And in most, but not all cases, the privileged pair is named first in the way we speak. Light, dark. We rarely say dark, light. We say light, dark. We say man, woman. We say right, wrong. So when we do this, postmodernists point out that this is, first of all, just notice there's a bias in our thinking from the start. We're privileging something. I know that's a loaded word now, but when they were using it, it meant very literally that one term is said to possess something truer, something more real, something better than the other part of the binary. And usually, historically, whichever one is better comes first in the binary, in the way that we speak it or write it. So, all right, so you have these binaries, you have these pairs. what Derrida wants to do with deconstruction is a method of taking the privilege within the binary and showing through the method that neither one of the pairs is actually truer or better or purer than the other. That in some sense, it's not even though that they're equal. They're not equal. They're also not hierarchical. They're in flux. They're in play, like water swishing about on a thing. The point is not the line between the binaries, Derrida notices, changes with culture and time. So, for example, you can take the binary man-woman, which we now can see. The line between that has shifted. It's very easy to see that in our culture now. But even if you go historically, Derrida writes before any of the gender stuff has really come out that we have now. Look at the Bible, where, I mean, I have long hair, but in Paul's culture, that would be completely wrong. That would be seen as sinful because I would be looking like a woman. But if a woman had short hair, that would equally be sinful. So the line between man and woman is at one time, is in one sense clear. It's not like cultures are uncertain about that, but it's also always a little bit in flux. So you have privilege, and then you have a moving line, and then the last thing is what deconstruction does is it says, well, it plays a thought experiment. What would happen if, for the sake of argument, we privileged the other term, the lesser term, and pretended that it was the privileged term? By doing this, Derrida thinks what happens is you see it. You're not trying to make the other term in actuality the new privileged term. You're not trying to do this. So you're not trying to take man-woman, so we know man is the privileged term in patriarchy and woman is not. What Derrida would do is Derrida would say, well, let's reverse that, and now let's pretend that woman is the privileged term. We're not doing that to make woman the privileged term. By making woman the privileged term in our thought experiment, what we end up finding out is that the word man can't exist without the word woman, that man needs to be defined by woman, and woman needs to be defined by man, and light needs to be defined by darkness, and darkness needs to define light, and that the two are actually in a closer, similar relationship, and that the binary is probably more arbitrary than we want to admit. And the reason why we don't want to admit that the binary is more arbitrary is because binaries give power to people and organizations and institutions. If you can say that man, woman, and man is the privileged term, and as an example, and so therefore women don't have as much access or privilege or rights as other things, well, then that has to be enforced, because what you're saying is there's something truer or purer or greater or better or whatever the adjective would be that privileges man over woman or whatever else. It doesn't have to be gender. And so by playing the thought experiment of privileging the other, you find out that they need each other. And that if you reverse the roles in a thought experiment, it will be easier to see that these differences aren't that different, that one always relies on the other and the other relies on the one.
Yeah.
So
they give each other, they almost work together to give each other a fuller meaning, right? Of some, I think that's one of the first things you said is that deconstruction gets you to a vaguer meaning, something that's more vague. But what's interesting there is, immediately I think I'm kind of like, what do you mean vague? But it's almost like you're saying something more vague is fuller. It's a better understanding. Is that right?
Sort of. So here's the way. Yes, you're exactly on the right track. Derrida uses a helpful example. He says in the history of philosophy, philosophers have only written about things in the world and life and wisdom and all that. They've only written about it in two ways, actively or passively. So they've talked about what a thing is or what a thing is not. That's the active way of describing it. Or they've thought about it passively. They've interacted with other philosophical ideas from the past. So they have a way of talking about things philosophically with an active voice or a passive voice. But Derrida says none of them know how to use the middle voice in grammar. And what he's trying to do with deconstruction is a binary only has an active and a passive voice, a privileged and an unprivileged term, something that's done and something that's done to. He's trying to show there's actually a middle voice, but we don't know how to describe anything in the middle voice when we're talking philosophically because it's never been done before. So Derrida doesn't say, I know how to speak in the middle voice. Instead, he's ripping the middle of that line, that binary, open and hoping that what will emerge is some sense of the middle voice to describe something. So again, it's not destroying something. It's actually trying to open up a new way of talking about something. And that's what postmodernism is really trying to do.
Meant to do. That's so interesting because that's obviously not how people, I think, in the, in the common, just
once it gets diluted and thrown into a bunch of stuff. And another misnomer.
Almost the opposite.
Yeah. And another misnomer, a huge misnomer, is that postmodernism is Marxist. Couldn't be further from the truth. Derrida and the other postmodernists were anti-Marxists. Derrida believed that postmodernism and deconstruction were liberalizing in the classical liberal sense, and that they were democratic, that they were the exact opposite of Marxism, because they weren't making everything equal, but it was giving everything an equal share by blowing up the divide in the binaries and saying you need each other. So it was actually equal. It was a move to try to, in one sense, equalize, but not equalize by flattening. This is where that middle voice comes in. So he doesn't want to just say, well, we're all equal. Everything's the same. That's dumb. He knows that. Everything's not the same. But things don't what Derrida wants to say is things don't have to exist in a power relationship of a domineering and a domineered, of a privileged and an underprivileged, of a higher and a lower, of a valued and a less valued. So he sees this as democracy at work in interpreting and reading texts. For Derrida, the way that someone would take over and control you is by controlling the interpretation of a text. That's how they're going to dominate you in a democracy. So we need a method to call them out when they try to arbitrarily assume power, which is the great threat to democracy. So you do have Marxist postmoderns, of course, but originally this was not a Marxist project. This was a democratic project that was anti-Marxist.
All of this sounds great in theory, and you've been talking about how a lot of this for Derrida was a thought experiment, or it was theorizing. What if we flip these terms? Did he ever account for the fact that this would happen in actuality, or that, and then maybe this might be the same question asked in a different way, or a different question. He's, what you said, or what I heard you say, is that he's assuming a power relationship doesn't always have to be at play. But is that, can we escape that? Because I think the breakdown that we've seen is that that's kind of a hard thing to escape. Or theorizing doesn't stay in theory, it becomes actuality for people. I feel like there's a relationship between those two, but it might be more broad than how I'm asking it.
No, I think you're tracking very well. So to answer your question, no, Derrida understands that we actually can't stop the power relationships from happening. Because we can't stop making binaries. That's what we do. Now, as a Christian, you might say that's sin at work. Is when we make binaries that God hasn't made. Derrida wouldn't even like that. He wouldn't like to say that God had made binaries that are enforceable. But for a Christian, you could take Derrida's idea and you could say, well, God made certain binaries, like man, woman, or whatever. And maybe he didn't privilege one within the other as far as rights and things go. But there's a clear line for God between that, where Derrida would say there's less so. But Derrida says, no, we can't stop the binaries. So this is no utopian project of of optimism, which is why he's often accused of being a nihilist, although he vehemently denies it. He sees that his project has a certain kind of optimism within it, but it's not a utopianism, which is why he's not a Marxist. We don't get to a utopia in postmodernism. We don't get to a place of Star Trek where, the Federation comes around and everything gets better. The best we can do is keep deconstructing. Now, he's a Jew. He's more of a cultural Jew than a practicing Jew. It's very hard to know if he believed in God or not, actually, in his personal life. It's really hard to tell. But here's what he does with God in The Gift of Death, is he says, what's the one trait about God in Judaism and Christianity which has affected the West the most? And he decides that what that is Messianism. So that's what unites Judaism and Christianity in his mind. The Jews were looking forward to the Messiah coming. Christians are looking forward to the Messiah coming again. They share this eschatological hope. Derrida says, if you think about it, the hope for the Messiah is the same hope that deconstruction has. Because the idea is that something will come in and will finally stop the one thing that we can't stop ourselves. In the case of deconstruction or postmodernism, it's the binaries that create oppression. The Messiah is a needed concept because it says that one day God will come and essentially he'll shut down all the bad binaries and he'll bring peace, justice, and hope to the world. But Derrida says, I don't want the Messiah to really come. He actually says, I do want him to come, and then he says, I don't want him to come, because he does that give and take thing. But why? Because if the Messiah comes, there'll be true closure and true meaning will come to everything. And what if he's not a good Messiah? Then what? So there's this. On the one hand, Derrida says, I hope for the Messiah, because we need him to come and finally stop this cycle we can't stop. But I'm terrified of the Messiah, because what if he doesn't do things the way that they should be done, and now there's closure that's inescapable. And there's a quote, I actually found this, I'll read you quickly. This is not from Derrida, this is from his student, who's also a very famous philosopher in his own right, named John Caputo. And he writes, is this the one? Yeah. Were the Messiah ever to show up in the flesh, were, per impossible, his coming ever taken to be an occurrence in historical time, something that could be picked up on a video camera, that would be a disaster. The effect would be to shut down the very structure of time and history, to close off the structure of hope, desire, expectation, promise, in short, the future. So Derrida recognizes, and Caputo's commenting on Derrida's view there, sort of what Paul says in 1 Corinthians, faith, hope, and love, these remain.
Yeah.
But the greatest of these is love, because when the Messiah actually comes, you don't need to hope anymore because the hope has been realized. All of God's promises disappear in one sense when he arrives because they're fulfilled. Yeah. They exist, of course, in a historical sense of his promise and fulfillment, but his coming again, once he comes again, is no longer a promise. It's fulfilled. And so Derrida recognizes this is a shutting down of the future, of hope itself, of as well as injustice and all these other things. But what is it? Where does that leave us? So that's where his atheism, or his, I shouldn't say his atheism, where his agnosticism.
Yeah, because he didn't have. I mean, as Christians, we would disagree because faith and hope, as Paul says, ends up in love. Like we count that as a promise that is sure. We hope for that as a promise that's sure. But what you're saying is Derrida didn't have that promise. So he's left terrified, right? Because he doesn't know where the lack of faith or the lack of hope will leave him. An article written last summer in Mere Orthodoxy. I don't know if you saw it, but I think it was written by a pastor. He was comparing deconstruction to Luther's Theology of the Cross, which I'm picking up, I'm interested in your thoughts on that comparison, because some of the stuff you're saying, I can see some similarities.
Yeah, so theology of the cross versus theology of glory are Lutheran ways of speaking about, Lutheran terms for speaking about things, kind of pulling together big themes in Scripture. And so a theology of glory is the default way that sinful people relate to God. And it means that we still think, even after all that Jesus has done, that there's something we have to do to make God happy with us or to love us. And so when we feel guilt, rightfully, at our sin, because the Holy Spirit and the law convicts us of sin, so that's not a bad thing. And when we seek repentance, also a good thing, and the fruit of the Holy Spirit. But what often happens is somewhere in that sequence, we start to go, I feel guilty, or I need to repent because it will make me look better before God. It's the right thing to do. And there's some merit seeking deep within our psyche that's there. And this is contrasted with the theology of the cross, which is a theology that says essentially what Jesus said on the cross: it is finished. And that Jesus completely paid the price of our sin and completely finished any work that was necessary for us, that would be required for us to be on God's good graces and have eternal life. And so a theology of glory is a theology that ultimately seeks to self-enrich us, and a theology of the cross is one that seeks to impoverish us. But of course, this works on Jesus's way of, like, the first will be last and the least will be the greatest. The theology of the cross impoverishes us by telling us there's nothing we can do, but it impoverishes us so that we can be filled with the fullness that Christ has completed. A theology of glory isn't willing to fully impoverish itself. It's willing to take a little bit out so that it can put its own filthy rags or whatever back in.
Yeah.
Now, when you take these ideas and you take this theology of the cross and you compare it with postmodernism and deconstructionism, there's definitely some crossover and entanglement that would work there. I think where postmodernism would certainly depart, and I've written a little bit about this, is Luther has a statement. I don't remember where it is off the top of my head, but the statement is, what can I, upon facing death, say amen? It's the question he asks. And that is a pastoral question as much as it is a philosophical one. And of course, the answer for that for Luther is only Jesus Christ. When my death is coming for me, the only hope I have is Jesus Christ. So what can I, upon hearing that I'm going to die, say amen? Jesus Christ. I don't think Derrida has any answer to that at all.
Yeah.
And in that sense, at some point, postmodernism may be on a parallel track with the theology of the cross, but at that point, it certainly becomes a theology of glory. And that's maybe a very postmodern way of thinking about it, because it's still, again, a little bit of that give and take, where I think what I find appealing about postmodernism, although I'm not a postmodernist, but I appreciate the critique of hubris in institutional confidence. You know, institutions are very confident that whatever they think are their essentials are right and everyone else is wrong, and they are willing to defend and oppress, if I can use, I know that language is sometimes commandeered by progressives, but in the true sense of that word, and oppress others in order to maintain their confidence in their narrative. And postmodernism just shows the emperor has no clothes, and I'm appreciative of that. And I think that can be good for our neighbor at some point. But also have to recognize postmodernism is indiscriminate in that, which means it's also going to do that to the church. And at some levels, that's healthy, because the church is an imperfect institution in the way it lives itself out. But we can't allow the church to be completely stripped of its truth and essentials as postmodernism
Yeah.
might want to do at times as well. So I find postmodernism, I guess in the language of like an investor, it's a hedge. It's a hedge fund
Hmm.
against the worst excesses of institutions. And it
Yeah.
helps institutions think about the way they behave. But I think to adapt it as a full-fledged philosophy, yeah, I don't know how any institution could even really do that. And I don't think it was designed to
Right.
do that. It almost, I feel like in the history of postmodernism, it kind of all just kind of came out in a very short period of time in the 60s to the 80s, and then it almost ran away with itself. And now when people
Hmm.
talk about postmodernism, it means a lot more than what philosophical postmodernism, which is much more thoughtfully common, has a much more thoughtful commentary than
Yeah.
throwing around the word
Then-
postmodernism today for anything that is supposedly relativistic or without bounded definitions, which is a little unfair to the philosophy.
yeah. And I think that's a good nuance for people to think about and kind of ruminate on, because it is easy to throw that word out for anything that's just relative. And in some sense we have we've gone to that side where it does feel like a lot of times everything is relative now. Yeah, I'm curious how you see the relationship, and we've been kind of talking about this, the relationship now between postmodernism, deconstruction, and how we use those words specifically as Christians. Where has that diverged from the original meaning? What does it mean now? Like, how should, just your typical Christian, is there an understanding for the typical Christian when someone says, I've deconstructed or I'm deconstructing? Like, what do they mean by that?
And I think in modern parlance, most people, when they say like I'm deconstructing something, aren't doing postmodern Derridian deconstruction.
Yeah,
They're
right.
just taking something apart. They're doing what
Okay.
chefs do to the cheesecake, which is
Okay.
could or could not be a helpful thing to do, but don't blame
Hmm.
postmodernism for that. People have been doing that for a lot longer, and that's just a way of critique. That's a method of critique. It's not anything postmodern in and of itself. Again, postmodernism, deconstruction is very much about binaries. If you're not doing it to a binary, you're not doing postmodern deconstruction. You're very specifically trying to do something within a binary.
Okay.
But when people use these terms, because what happened is that kids all over the world, and particularly Americans in the 90s and up, all pretty much went to college. The
Yeah.
trades have seen a huge loss, and now they're becoming popular again. Everybody was told to go to college, and they all got postmodern theory in college. So the language got peppered into
Yeah.
a whole generation of teachers, now two or three generations now. And now the words are thrown around because they share some sort of overlap or similarity with the original, but they're not truly genuinely what it is. So postmodernism gets blamed for a lot of bad guy stuff that it's not. For example, a lot of people say it's relativistic. It's not relativistic. It fights in its literature. It's often fighting against that. It might be nihilistic. That could be
Mm.
true, but it's not relativistic. It doesn't believe that there's no truth. It just doesn't believe that there is any objective, verifiable truth that gives meaning to all things.
Do you think that that theology or the church scripture has an answer to those binaries that deconstruction either taps into, or that's completely different from what we're talking about when we talk about deconstruction?
I guess it depends. Yes, I think it depends on how one conceptualizes what the work of theology is. And I know that sounds like a cop-out, but traditionally, theology, the traditional definition of theology is, faith-seeking understanding. Theology can be done different ways, but in the traditional sense of faith-seeking understanding, then I think there's a part where deconstruction is helpful, again, in that it asks if there is such a thing as institutional sin, if if organisms, if institutions can, as institutions, corrupt and do sin. And that's a controversial, more modern idea. Of course,
Yeah.
biblically, humans do sin, but nations were, the nation of Israel was often held to account. Babylon was held to account. So it's not completely foreign that you can have institutions, in one sense, fit the sin category. But if that were possible, that institutions could sin, then deconstruction would be a way that you could say that an institution was acting unjustly and therefore was sinning. So, for example, an easy one would be just prior to the Civil War, when you had abolitionists in the North and pro-slave people in the South, and the Constitution had allowed for slavery. Now, how do you classify that as a theologian? Do you say, well, it's just individual people who are sinners? Or is there a place to be able to say that not having, an amendment that allows for emancipation and freedom of all people is a sin because it allows the perpetuation of slavery? So this is where deconstruction could have a way to teach us how to love our neighbor.
Because they give us a language for something that we haven't had language for. Is that a good way to think about it?
I think it gives some language to that, but I also think deconstruction gives a method by which it brings you back to your assumptions, and you have to question those assumptions. So, for example, all churches have had to, in the last 20, 30 years, have to define what marriage is. No one did that prior to 30 years ago.
Yeah.
But that has been a strengthening exercise for churches because they have had to rethink what marriage means. They've had to go back and take something that was just assumed always. Now, a lot of people are like scared and annoyed, but actually, if you're just a theologian, what it's saying is actually, we're being invited to go back to the Bible, and we're being invited to address an issue that was taken for granted and to give it a border. So postmodernism can get you to the place where you do that. Where it wouldn't get you, though, is it wouldn't want you to just create a new border. It wants to show you that the borders are in flux. But I don't think at some point Christianity just can't do that. But Christianity should have the courage, if it's faith-seeking understanding, to be going back again and again. And I'm not saying always reforming, because it's not like everything needs to be reformed. I mean, there's Orthodox theology, creedal theology. We don't want to reform that. It's not always reforming. But it's always going back and saying, am I being faithful in light of my neighbor who is having real troubles? Part of what deconstruction and postmodernism, I think, can do is it can give institutions means by which they can at least go back and check their assumptions. And if we believe in biblical truth, then we may affirm our assumptions. But now we'll affirm them with greater confidence because we've had to go back.
Yeah. And maybe with a touch more, like you said, understanding of pain and suffering. Because I think, I'm curious, do you think that's happening? Because what I hear a lot of is that people are leaving the church, really specifically, a lot of times because of these social issues, because of homosexuality and transgenderism, or even, we talked a little bit about political identity, and the church not addressing those things and not having an answer for them, like just flat out not having an answer. That's what you hear is the critique. And you just said there you see a lot more now nuance in the way churches are talking about that. So I'm curious if you're hopeful that is a thing that's actually happening, or if the exodus of people leaving because there doesn't seem to be an answer is outweighing that.
There's a book I highly recommend. I'm drawing a blank right now. It's by Miroslav Volf. And do I have it over? I do have it. I don't know if I can find it right away. I will
No worries.
give it to you.
Yeah, I can put it in the show notes
Yeah,
later.
I don't know why I'm drawing a blank all of a sudden on it. It's a fantastic book, and I think it's one of the most important books for this kind of question that's out there. But the book is about, as Christians, how do we deal with things like racism and these
Yeah,
issues that divide
another
us. It
big
was
one.
written some years ago, like maybe 20 years ago, but it's just so theologically rich. Anyway, Miroslav Volf is an evangelical. He teaches at Yale. The book's very accessible, though. And he had grown up during the Serbian War. I forget, and he opens the book in the preface, and he says the derogatory term that he heard when he was growing up for the other side was called a cynic. And that word conjured for him people who came in and killed his family and villagers and raped the women and killed them and all this other stuff. I mean, it was just, So here he is, he's a Christian professor and everything, and some years later he's asked, can you love a cynic? A cynic. Can you love a cynic? And he thought about it, and he said, no, I can't. But I think Jesus would want me to. And I thought that was such a profound, honest answer. And the whole book is talking about what forgiveness really means in the Christian life as it practically has to be lived out. And as we walk through these different social issues and stuff, it's important that the church be humble in its proclamation of truth, which it hasn't always been. And when it was in Christendom, it was much easier for it to not be humble when everybody was or Jewish, and or if they weren't, they didn't really have a way to say otherwise. And the church is, I think, suffering somewhat from its arrogance of exclusivity. Church has to be exclusive. It has an exclusive claim to truth in the revelation of Jesus Christ. That's what it means to be a Christian. But it doesn't need to be arrogant about that exclusivity.
Yeah.
And it's learning the hard way that it needs to change the way that it relates to people. And the problem is a lot of churches are afraid that if they wouldn't use this language, but if they are kinder or less overt, not willing to be as nuanced, if they're that way, that they are in some slippery slope of accommodation. So being kind and humble leads to accommodation of cultural values. And I don't think that one has to lead to the other. If you have a strong and robust theology and you're confident in your theology, why would that lead to an accommodation of cultural things? A couple things at play here. One, being nice does not save people. So the other side is people think like, well, if I'm just nice, those are the people who actually end up accommodating because they believe that being nice wins people over. Well, no, you just end up getting transformed into. The point here is not to be nice. The point here is to love your neighbor by really listening to their story and really trying to put yourself in their shoes and understand their suffering. And only then can you begin to minister with the objective truths of Scripture back to them. And that may require, at times, I think it's rare, but it may at times require a change in theological language on how one expresses an eternal truth. And I think that's that change in language is a consensus the church builds over time.
Can you give an example of that?
I'll give you one very specific Lutheran one. Some people will be very mad at me about this, but the confessions and stuff will say that the Pope is the Antichrist. Now, what they mean by that is that because Catholicism still has within it a meritorious element where good works work in tandem with free justification, that therefore the Pope is not for full justification by faith alone and is therefore speaking like the devil would because he's still having people rely on their works. That's the idea behind the term the Pope is Antichrist. I don't know that even if you could say that that was theologically true in your system, I don't know that that's the way that it needs to be expressed. I would possibly assume that Christian love of neighbor might require something else.
Yeah.
Not because it's necessarily false, but because there are ways to speak about it that are more generous without losing the theological truth. One of the things like Miroslav Volf in that book I was mentioning pushes us towards is showing our neighbors respect and love and entering into their pain in no way requires us to have to necessarily change our values, but it might show us where our values are, or some of our values are just biases, and we don't need to hold them as values anymore.
Yeah.
And that's hard work. So what it means maybe is that to truly love my neighbor is always a risk of discovering that some of the things that I believe to be truthful are less truthful than I assumed. And most people are not willing to take that risk. And that doesn't mean everything's up for grabs. It just doesn't mean that. But it means some things are. And you won't know what those things are until you are willing to enter into your neighbor's suffering. I mean, there's a reason why Luther started burying suicide people in the churchyard, which was not allowed, because the Augustinian doctrine was, well, people who committed suicide committed murder, and murderers don't go to heaven, and so they can't be buried in sacred ground. Luther understood I guess I'll call it the human pain that was behind that, and believed that someone could be a Christian and just have sinned in that act of suicide but not lost their salvation and could be potentially buried in holy ground. That for now we might think that that's a silly thing, but that was a big deal back then.
Yeah, it's a big deal. Is that so? Do you think is it an interplay for the Christian between entering suffering and holding on to Scripture that gets us to that truth? Like, how do we enter this process of, I guess you could maybe call it deconstruction, or of better understanding, knowing that there are things that are not up for grabs, knowing there are things that are, like, what anchors us in that process?
The priest and writer Henry Nouwen, who some of the listeners I'm sure are familiar with, he had a sermon that he gave at the Crystal Cathedral in California back in, I think, the 80s or maybe early 90s. It must have been the 90s, because I think it was shortly before his death, which was in like 94, 96. He talks about their being like communion, being like the communion bread. I thought it was a very beautiful sermon. The communion bread is given. The communion bread is broken. The communion bread is blessed. It's broken and it's given. And of course, it's Christ's body. So it's to talk about the bread is to talk about Christ. And Christ has been given to us, but Nouwen goes to talk about how we're the disciples of Christ. And so it can be sometimes overwhelming to say, be like Christ, although we are to be like Christ. But what if we can start thinking about it by being like bread, the communion bread, which is Christ? We have been given life and all our stuff by God. We've been blessed by the truth that we have and the justification that we have in Jesus Christ and the promises that we have in Scripture. But in our being called to be disciples, we are broken and we're given to the world. We're sent out as sheep among wolves. And I think there's sometimes an overly triumphant sense in Christianity, triumphalism, sort of like onward Christian soldier,
yeah,
which has its place. But the image that probably will motivate Christians more and has historically from the martyrs and others is the idea of, being broken for your neighbor and giving your life over for the good of your neighbor. I've always had a problem with, and it's not wrong, I just think it's unhelpful. And there is some language in scripture that allows you to talk this way, but I don't personally like the idea of like talking about winning souls for Christ.
Yeah.
Because in our modern sense, winning, it makes it seem like it's a competition.
Yeah.
I much prefer the language of loving and serving our neighbor. And we go with the gospel as we do that. And
Right.
I think that what postmodernism in its best face is saying to us, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I think it's saying to us, be a good neighbor, but here's how you can be a good neighbor. Care about your neighbor's suffering and story. Because essentially you two are entwined in a way you don't understand. One thinks one's right, one thinks the other's less right, or right or wrong, depending on the relationship. But in fact, that neighbor is also defining you as much as you are defining them. So in a sense, postmodernism is saying you can't dispense of your neighbor. And in our political climate, where like the liberals hate the conservatives and the conservatives hate the liberals, that is not a Christian way to think. It's a worldly way to think. Well, the liberals are out to destroy everything. The conservatives are out to destroy everything. You can not like ideologies. That's fine. But as soon as you make it personal and say the liberals, the conservatives, we've lost something essential. And also, we fail to realize what postmodernism tells us is that there only is conservatives because of liberals and vice versa. The two need each other to keep this thing going. And what you see in like political polarization today is that each side is going more right or left because they keep bringing candidates up that are crazier and crazier because each successive candidate has to show the small base that they are truer conservative or more truer left than the other one. And so what you get is you get ideologies, political ideologies, that are going super extreme to play to bases because there's a fear that one would be soft on the other side.
Yeah.
And what Americans don't realize is that the line is moving. It's happening so slowly that the line is moving. And I think the only way you can bring that back without a war, without violence, is you have to start loving your neighbor.
I'm curious where you see forgiveness playing a role in all of this, because it seems to me that forgiveness potentially lives in that kind of middle way of speaking, but I'm not sure if deconstruction or postmodern philosophy, well, I know postmodern philosophy can't give us that language necessarily. What do you think about that? How can we potentially use this method, but also hold on to, one of the very central things of Christianity being that we have to forgive, and that we are forgiven.
So two things. First, I remember the name of the book by Miroslav Volf. It's Exclusion and Embrace.
Okay.
Great book. To answer your question on forgiveness, particularly, how does postmodernism help us with this? Well, first of all, postmodernism does have a place for forgiveness, but it's the same place it has for justice and all the other good things, in that they're always arriving but never arrive. So there's no place in postmodernism for a full or pure forgiveness. It's always, it's not quite accurate to say it's a process either in postmodernism. It's just, we're discovering new ways about what forgiveness means. It's that middle voice. So we're always learning, well, we thought we forgave, but there's parts that we didn't. So it's always arriving. It never arrives. I think what postmodernism can do And all these things that postmodernism, by the way, all these things that postmodernism can do doesn't mean that it exclusively does them. It's another tool in a toolbox. And I like to tell people this. And I think what it can do is it can, again, reveal to us some of the places where we have drawn lines that once we begin to deconstruct, we might lose confidence that at least where we've drawn the line should be drawn there. And if that becomes the case, then we need to seek forgiveness because we've not lived in truth. Postmodernism can allow for forgiveness when it shows us in some cases where we have made arbitrary lines. And how do we discover those arbitrary lines? Deconstruction, in that thought experiment, privileges the other term, and then that exposes certain things. And in that exposure, we hope we see truth. So you can think of postmodernism, at least in its best construction, as the pursuit of some kind of truth. Not objective truth, but at least truth within the binaries. And then you have to apply your Christian objective truth to that.
Yeah.
There is an application part that Christians have to do. But it exposes things we're blind to. And I don't know why that would be a bad thing.
Yeah.
But it is a scary thing because it makes us vulnerable.
Well, and I think it takes away our control, and it takes away a lot of what we can feel pride in and even identity in. I think it strips away all those things that we probably shouldn't have our identity in, but we do. And that's really scary.
Yeah.
Bruce, thanks so much. This was great. I learned a ton, and I'm going to be thinking about this stuff a lot. And I want to read that Miroslav Volf book, so I'm going to
Exclusion and Embrace. Great book.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
So since we started last fall, Outside Ourselves has been posted in 2 different places on YouTube. It's been available on the 1517 YouTube channel, as well as an Outside Ourselves channel, which is separate. Well, in the next couple of weeks, maybe the next month, what's going to happen is that a lot of the 1517 individual shows that are on the 1517 channel are going to break away into their own individual channels. And so that means that if you only subscribe to the 1517 channel, you're not going to see any updates from Outside Ourselves from me, Kelsi Climbera. So what I would like you to do right now is, if you are not subscribed to that specific channel, if you can do that really quickly, that will ensure that you see any updates from this show, from anything else that I'm doing. You're going to do that by going to the show notes, going under where it says subscribe, clicking the YouTube link. That will take you directly to the Kelsi Climbera /Outside Ourselves channel, and you can subscribe there. Once you're subscribed, you'll of course get any updates for new shows, as well as be able to see any clips from shows if you want just like a snippet of what we're talking about from one week to the next. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.